This is essentially an occupier-driven bit of analysis, 50 cities across Europe, and we're really looking at the occupier strength, the economic strength, the diversity of these cities, particularly as they drive towards higher value-added sector jobs. So that's the kind of summary of the orientation, and I'll run you through some of the details and some of the results, and it will produce a few eyebrow raisers. So just to summarise, 8 categories that we look at. There's a lot of detail behind each of these categories in terms of providing the analysis or generating the analysis. So economic output is obviously size, it's the scale, it's the GVA that's produced by each city, and it looks not just at the city, but its catchment, so it's the entire economic ecosystem that it reaches out to, commuter zone of an hour drive time or train journey. But it also looks at the productivity of each city in terms of GVA produced per worker, so not just total scale. And it then looks at on the workforce catchment side, similar factors. The orientation is where there's a real focus on which cities have got a high proportion of people in high value added service activity rather than public sector or rather than support services. So the orientation is the scores go to cities that do that better than others. Latent talent or future employment capacity is about what's the latent talent of people within that market, short-term unemployed with skills, seniors with skills as we call them, people hitting retirement age but are still highly competent at staying in the workforce, and then also the youth coming through school into the system. We then look at fresh talent coming through students in universities, so number of graduates and students in institutions within the catchment area, but also the quality and the ranking of those institutions. Employee aspirational factors is about quality of life. So we added this to this study for this time around, and that's becoming more important. So it's pollution levels, crime rates, access to healthcare, as much as property prices to income ratios, and another factor which is the capacity to save or the propensity to save based on income over outgoings, employer costs, salaries, on costs, cost of real estate, and the total occupational cost of real estate for offices. And then employer key factors, country risk, economic trade, exchange rates, credit ratings, labour law flexibility, and corporate taxation rates. So there's quite a lot that goes into it. It's pretty thorough. There's a pretty balanced view in terms of how we've done it this year. Last year there was a much higher orientation on risk because we had all of the political events. I think that's changed slightly. People are just adjusting to that political risk now. But anyway, let's see what the results show. So if we look at the first couple of factors, economic output versus workforce catchment, these are the top 20 markets. London is far out in front, and Dublin is probably a real surprise market to be that far up as a small city, but it generates more GVA per worker than any other city in Europe. It's a really strong, focused city. Paris is pretty much the same as London in terms of economic output, but its workforce catchment and orientation is much more public sector, whereas London's is much more private sector, higher value-added services. And then you get a real clustering of lots of cities around the middle. UK cities do well, other regional cities overall, but they also show that they could be a lot more productive than they currently are relative to the size of that city or relative to the economic output that they produce. Orientation. This throws up some different cities. So this is not based on size, it's the proportion of people in the workforce who are in higher value-added services. So financial business services, IT telecoms, professional, scientific, technical roles. Warsaw comes in number 5. It's led by Zurich, possibly not that much of a surprise, but then you've got Edinburgh and Dublin in there alongside London. So while Munich comes in 6th, you've got a few of the Nordic and CE markets in there, but there isn't that much in terms of southern European cities, which tend to be quite public sector driven. Employee aspirational factors. When you look at this, I think one thing to look at is just how tight the scores are overall when you combine quality of life with the ability or propensity to save. But actually, all of the cities that are highest ranked here, 3 of them are next to the Alps, so living next to the mountains is clearly a good thing for you when it comes to quality of life. But Munich comes out on top because not only is it a nice city to live in next to the mountains, but it also has a high propensity to save, which makes it number 1. If you look at the UK cities, the only one that features in here is Edinburgh, and I think the UK has been challenged in the last year or two in terms of its overall quality of life or aspirational factors. If we look at fresh talent, so this is the university catchment of cities. So it's the size, the number of institutions within that market, or supporting that market, and the overall ranking that they get in terms of being within the top universities globally, let alone in Europe. London's miles out in front. It's a long way ahead of every other city, quite considerable. And then again, you've got a real clustering of German and UK regional cities on this side, some of the Nordic, Spanish, French major cities on the other side, which again, this suggests to me that, and I think whilst it's changing or improving, for some of these markets, they have a high level of talent coming through local institutions and universities, but they're not necessarily always capturing them. So people are studying in these cities, but maybe moving to London, which is what I did when I studied in Manchester, or going elsewhere. So they're pulling or keeping more students in, but if they're going to grow as cities and evolve, then they need to do that more and more. Employer costs versus employer factors. So if you're at the top, you're low cost. If you're at the bottom, this side is low risk, that side is high risk. So basically what you've got here is all the UK cities at the front end in terms of their sort of operational risk score. So it's the easiest market to work in, so it's the easiest market to operate in, it's got the lowest risk, and it's also got relatively low corporation tax rates. You move back along, you've got Helsinki is up next, Copenhagen, Sweden, Zurich, all pretty close, Dublin, Oslo, not too far off, but all relatively expensive. London's down here because it's so much more expensive than everywhere else. And then a couple of outliers, Tallinn, Prague, easy markets to operate in, but also very low cost, relatively. Put it all together, and this is what it looks like. So this is the rank. This is the cities of influence rank of each of these cities. So number 1, number 2, and number 3, London, Paris, and Madrid. And part of the panel discussion is to what extent does this correlate to where the investment capital is going. So this is the rank of where investment capital went in 2017. So the top 3 COI markets are the same top 3 markets for where investment capital went. Yeah, does that make sense? Then we get a real anomaly. So Moscow comes in as number 4. You think, what the hell is Moscow doing in at number 4? I wasn't trying to get free tickets for the World Cup this year. Honest. But interestingly, if you go back to pre-2013, Moscow was actually the number 4th ranked city for investment volumes before everything changed. So there is some rationale as to why it's there, but it's clearly not an investment market of choice for many at the minute, even though investment volumes have improved. 5 comes Birmingham. Surprised me, personally. Having gone to Birmingham, I think it was about 18 months ago, I was really actually surprised at how much that city has changed and is forming into what feels like a real city. You can actually work your way around. There's lots of new development. I think last year it received one of the highest levels of FDI, certainly in the UK and of any city in Europe, and it is changing. But its investment rank doesn't necessarily correlate to that. Then you got Munich, number 6, the highest ranking German city, and actually in terms of where the investment volumes went, not far off, so there's a bit of a balance there. And then you've just got lots of different cities after this. So the orange represents where the investment and the COI score actually matches. Yellow represents where it's pretty close. Everything else is where they're not quite matching up. So why that is, well, you guys can discuss it on the panel. But I think if you look at the comparison of those 2 scores here, so this is investment volumes 2017. This is the COI score. So you can see London, Paris, way ahead. So Madrid you've got is number 3. Berlin was very close behind, but Berlin's score in terms of its COI ranking is way down here. It's number 18. So why is that? I mean, I think part of this reason for Berlin's score being a bit weaker on COI is because it's still a very public sector driven city. So even though it's got a burgeoning tech sector and it is changing, the size of that sector in terms of employees relative to public sector is still marginal, and it will take some time for that city to evolve. But equally, if you look at it on the COI score side, it's all quite compact, so there's a lot of competition between all these different cities, and they will move around over the years as they change, as they evolve, and become better investment destinations. But what it also says to me is there's a lot of cities here, particularly some of the UK regional cities, that look underinvested as markets relative to their occupational strength. To what extent is that capital being held back because of Brexit? And let's look at a couple of other interesting factors. The occupational strength of markets is one thing, yield pricing is another, and the availability of product. So this gives an indication of stock under construction, office stock, so fresh product coming into the market, available to purchase, which is important. The yellow dots represent where yields are. Now the first thing that I see when I look at these yields is there's not many markets, bar Moscow, that are above 5% these days. And there are a lot of markets that are getting very, very low, 3, even sub 3, a lot sub 4. But here you've got all the regional markets that are 5 and a bit, 5.2, 5%, which to me, is that a Brexit discount that's being applied? Or is there a high risk that's being applied to those markets? Because from a yield perspective, they look pretty attractive. If you look at the risk spread of prime yields in markets relative to bond rates, you see a completely different picture. So lots of these markets at the top end with a higher spread are some of the more obscure, smaller markets that you're probably not going to be pumping a lot of money into, like Sevilla and Zagreb, because they just don't have critical mass. And it takes a while before you hit some of the more mature markets, but the first one that comes up is Copenhagen, makes it look more interesting. Then you got regional UK cities again, before you get to some of the German cities and some of the more Nordic cities. So that bond rate is based on the bond rate now. Bond rates, as we know, are changing. They're definitely moving up, as are interest rates. I don't think interest rates or bond yields will move up that much because all of the bigger factors that are happening in the world, weight of capital, demographics, are suppressing the natural rate of R, as it's called. But they will definitely move up and they will start squeezing that spread. And then the other interesting thing, which is worth just throwing in here, is the strategy of dry powder, as it were. So this looks at global capital of property funds under management, and it looks at the strategy of that of those funds. And what you can see is all the money is now in opportunistic and value-added strategies. So a lot of money is moving up the risk curve, and to what extent? Well, does that mean that they'll start moving into some different markets rather than sticking with the ones that they've gone in the last 2 or 3 years? Cities of influence rank, investment rank. I put in the ULI rank here because this is where they think the money should be going in 2018. What they said last year, they didn't get very many markets right, they only got one right. So whether that's a real marker of where the capital is going to go is another thing. But again, their rank, there are some similarities to ours, but there's also some big differences. So what I've also tried to put in is, what prime yields are, what the spread is over bonds. So the green ones mark out where the spread is better. And then this is the outlook for rents and yields and there's values. So again, dark green means there's a stronger value drivers for office real estate. Light green, reasonable drivers of increase in values. So it means anything that's green is probably going to maybe push up the rankings in terms of where investment will go. Anything that's red means it may drop further down. But anyway, I'll leave that for you guys to discuss. Thank you.
Great, thanks David.